Anarchists often note that there is a difference between protest and direct action. Protest is an appeal to the authorities to behave differently. Direct action, whether it's a matter of a community building, a well, trying to shut down a meeting, or occupying a factory, it is a matter of acting as if the existing structure of power does not even exist. Direct action is ultimately the defiant insistence on acting as if one is already free. David Graeber, world-renowned anthropologist and author, known for his capitalist critiques and anarchist views.
Welcome to Conversations on Healing and Growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins. Over the last few weeks, we've focused on how conscious change and conscious revolution can impact a world driven by ego and greed. Such conscious revolution thrives in the remembrance of our innate connection to ourselves and to the earth, an innate connection to our wisdom and a willingness to face our fears, our judgments, and the systems informed by fear that are now threatening a more sustainable world.
We are in this moment where, it feels like capitalist extraction of our resources, our labor, goods, all of this being taken from our communities has been the norm forever and ever and ever. It's this moment that's perpetually kind of falling in on itself. But looking at history, just even a cursory glance, we know that capitalism is a system that's actually made up a very small part of our existence.
In fact, only 500 years. But we'll dig into that part a bit later. With a centralized form of government built around large corporations, around a financial system and resources that, by design, are extracted from communities without bringing back anything of long-lasting value to the community.
The corporate narrative, we're offering employment to you. Isn't that enough? Isn't that what you want? But considering everything at this juncture, employment is frankly an inadequate and often inequitable exchange. Employees are largely left out of the conversation on their own well-being, as well as the impact that the corporation makes on the community at every level. We've alluded to this before, but the tragic loss of union-supported employment over the last 60 years has ensured this lack of conversation, this lack of taking care. And in turn, the government lacks the resources or else, I guess, the willingness to bring together employers and employees to legislate fair compensation, especially when it comes to access to healthcare and paid time off and housing. So in this way, most employees feel that there's very little sense of long-term growth and security within any position that they may hold. And with whatever is coming next, I would argue with the corporate implementation of AI, this picture must either change radically or we face a world unsustainable for most of humanity.
Our intent for today's episode is to step into a creative exploration of real systems that have and can directly serve communities through egalitarian regeneration. Now, we use that word in particular because this is a conversation around healing and growth. We want to look at how can human beings, how can communities be valued? How can resources move freely in and out of communities and between communities rather than being hoarded by a tiny percentage of the population? When we use the word regeneration in this way, we are speaking of a rebirth of value and resources being equitably restored into communities in a healthy exchange with its surrounding world.
Right. In that sense, the inspiration for a lot of this, many of the ideas and the questions that we're going to explore at the heart of this episode emerged when you shared with me, Martin, this great article from Lekam Kienzer called Justice is Geometric. It's published over on eon.co. This heavily features the work of Ron Eglash, who's an ethno-mathematician. Very curious combination of geniuses there. And I think that that's going to be something that you'll kind of hear as we talk about what Eglash is getting at, right?
So, Injustice is Geometric, Kienzer presents examples from societies that existed in Africa before the colonial powers stepped in and altered Africa in ways that Africans to this day are continuing to pay a debt for. A debt that's not theirs, yet the one that they're having to pay because, in essence, the colonial powers came in, extracted resources, in essence, stole resources and people. Then, when it no longer served their needs, left. These societies existed in what Eglash refers to as being fractal in nature.
Okay, so fractal in nature, fractals, this mathematical space to consider. Let's imagine a black triangle. And inside this triangle, imagine a white triangle appears, but this one is upside down. So the presence of this upside down triangle inside the original has now created a pattern where we see three upright triangles. Now visualize that same pattern replicating within the original infinitely. So in this sense, fractals are complex patterns that are self-similar across different scales, right? In one sense, they're images of dynamic systems, the pictures of chaos. Geometrically speaking, they exist in between our familiar dimensions, how we perceive things physically, how we perceive things within our minds. Fractal patterns are extremely familiar in our world because they appear everywhere in nature. I mean, you can see them in trees, in rivers, in coastlines, in mountains, in clouds, in seashells, in hurricanes. All of these parts of our world, something that we look at with awe often and sometimes even feel separate from, well, they all express fractal geometry across multiple scales. Again, so many different scales in the examples that I gave. Now, talking about being between dimensions, we can also consider abstract fractals, such as the Mandelbrot set, which can be generated by a computer calculating a simple equation over and over.
In a nutshell, a fractal tells a story of the process that created it. The how in fractals is just the same as it is in consciousness, right? If we're focused only on the destination, then we can never replicate the initial simplicity of the pattern, of the practice. The destination isn't the point with a fractal nor with a conscious mode of living. The pathway there is. If humanity's core societal process is to lie in egalitarian regeneration, then it'll repeat over and over again, creating a healthy, loose, yet patterned way of living that isn't about resource and wealth hoarding. In this sense, we can see that fractals are in essence neutral because they're natural. And what I mean by neutral, I mean that they're neither good nor bad inherently. They're neither Democratic or Republican, liberal or progressive or conservative or fascist. It's how they are applied that matters. What we've learned over the last 50 years is that economic and social systems built around rampant disparities stop functioning well for most people at a certain point. We're there right now. We also know that end-stage capitalism, without great oversight, ends up at this end stage over and over again from its extractive colonial roots. It's where it naturally ends up every time. This is why egalitarian regeneration is so important.
Right. So we're starting to put these pieces together, expressions within both the natural world and within human endeavor, especially when not centrally controlled. That's something that we're going to continue to really massage into shape with our work here today. An important example of how human endeavor can be inspired by what's in the natural world comes through biomimicry. So it's all those natural systems and forms that we basically get excited about. And this has sparked groundbreaking innovations that are both efficient and sustainable. How a gecko can stick to glass or wood, that chemical makeup in a gecko, that study of that lent itself to how we created advanced adhesives, right? Or how burrs in the forest on plants that'll catch to your pants. Well, that inspired the invention of Velcro. And I think a really cool one that'll take a little more understanding to get, but a kingfisher, right, is a bird that has an incredibly long aerodynamic beak. And when the Japanese engineers who developed the bullet train were trying to figure out about the shape of the engine and that aerodynamic efficiency that they were seeking, well, they were inspired by the kingfisher's beak. So it's really cool stuff. I highly recommend everybody explore this space around biomimicry. All of this human endeavor and these fractal patterns that we're seeing across the world puts us right at the heart of the matter. Really getting into Kanzer's article over on Eon, there's a lot of awesome and insightful stuff that he's pulling, not just from Iglash, but also from a study that the professors at the Ekiti State University in Nigeria did about the history and organization of the guild system in pre-colonial Benin. So a little historical context for you here. Over the course of roughly 650 years, from the 13th century to the end of the 19th century, when the British invaded, Benin had upwards of 68 guilds. And guilds are collectives of craftspeople and professionals, primarily organized by family and age. And these guilds served the Oba, the king's needs. So, for instance, the iron workers made large lamps, knives, and iron chairs for the Oba. From doctors to drummers, acrobats, and cattle keepers, guilds developed for every aspect of life. So, in this sense, in Benin, while all guilds led back to the centralized patriarchal power of the Oba in some way, it's really cool how Kyanze here notes in his writing that each guild had a self-organizing structure in its district and an interdependence with other guilds in its area. Guild leaders managed their physical space, administrative affairs, and even certain judicial processes. Like many prefectures, they could collectively control the conditions of their livelihood. The guild system operated with fluidity and autonomy, but was also orderly. So it is in these kinds of historical facts of life where I think the white supremacist myth that the colonial powers came to Africa to tame savages just instantly falls apart, right? This was a wonderfully nuanced and beautifully organized system. Now, we could argue against any kind of hierarchy or monarchy is that is existing here, but it's undeniable that the fractal nature and regenerative qualities of how resources were used within the Benin Guild systems was not about extraction. It was all about that regeneration within the communities.
Beautifully said, Ben. Thank you. You really painted us a beautiful picture of how extraordinary these guild systems were. In drawing from Kyanzer's work, and as well Paulus Gerdes, who wrote on the mathematical elements of the Chokwe Sona tradition, we see how generational knowledge in the Chokwe people of Angola is passed down through Lusona. Now, Lusona, or Sona, Lusona being the singular, Sona being the plural, is a intricate design that's drawn in sand or on other materials that grows more and more complex as its practitioners age through life. As practitioners within the Sona tradition learn to draw more elaborate Lusona, they also entered deeper levels of shared knowledge and belonging. In that sense, the practice made the principle plain. These fractal forms, these shared stories told through this artwork, expressed through the sona, they were centered around proverbs, fables, shared games, animals, and it played an enormous role in the transmission of knowledge and wisdom from generation to generation. So this is an example where a shared form of artwork serves as a interconnective tool for knowledge and wisdom. And another example I'd like to share with you, and I'm taking this from chapter 7 of my book, language and the values that it expresses can also have an enormous impact in how we construct reality, the story we live in. And the example that comes to mind are the efforts of the Lakota Nation to revive and restore its spoken language. Now, the Lakota people are the people of North and South Dakota and Nebraska historically. And while the American government and the Catholic Church suppressed the language, fluent Lakota speaker and member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe, Francis Whitebird, describes a time when he was young that only a small number of Lakota spoke English. Today, it's the opposite. Only a small number speak Lakota. In the 70s, the spoken language began to be taught in schools. Sadly, according to Whitebird, this program has produced few fluent speakers. He emphasizes the need for the culture to be taught within the home. And he contrasts the experience of taking his children to Lakota ceremonies rather than learning about them from books written by people outside the culture. People like John Neihardt, who wrote Black Elk Speaks. Whitebird sees the Lakota language as being structurally formed in distinctly different ways than English or other Indo-European languages. This difference in its structural formation is representative of a different worldview that can be seen within the culture itself. He also sees the language as having an esoteric aspect. Esoteric in the sense that as one steps deeper into the knowledge of the language within the culture, its sacred nature is revealed. In much the same way I was speaking only a moment ago around the Lusona, right? So whether we're talking about artistic expression or we're talking about language, when a culture explores itself from its roots in this deeply spiritual and I would say wisdom-based way, something else arises. The development for the speaker unfolds from expressing one's needs to more conversational forms and ultimately advances in stages to a language that is spiritual in nature. In other words, it connects deeply with nature. By definition, in both of these instances, what I'm describing is something that's inherently fractal in nature. If the Lakota can establish or reestablish the language amongst their people, it will allow for a different kind of community connection with the very roots of what makes them who they are. Another notable point is that because Lakota is a language that's set within its culture, that have a set of meanings that grow over time as you learn the language more and more deeply, that when you translate these concepts into English, something intrinsically changes. You've taken it out of the culture, just like attempting to take what's expressed through the Lusona into modern life. It has to be developed within the community itself. So if we're going to talk about how this notion of how something that's fractal in nature, it finds its expression, we're going to need to start with its rooted sense in place and in culture. I remember a clip with Denzel Washington as the director of the movie Fences and his cast, in which he's asked, why is it that the film needed to have a black director? And he says, it's not about race, it's about culture. And that's the element here that we want to build upon, because this is establishing communities that are interconnected in this way serves as the foundation for the stories and experiences that form our worldview and as well our view of ourselves.
This is really, really key, right? All these examples that you're talking about here, from the Lakota to the Chokwe in Angola, these very rooted traditions, these generation to generation things, something that Ron Eglash, the ethnomathematician who is quoted often in Kianzer's piece, also talks about. Kinship being one strand, age another, place another, economic life another, but they overlap in this respect, right? Multiple routes to resolution were possible. And what we're seeing here is that we live in a society that is missing all of that, right? Because our society is rooted in colonial power. That root is extraction. Take, 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 take in this way that is so brutal. This degree of brutality over hundreds of years through so many minority communities and ethnicities has brought us to a point where everyone in every walk of life is so depleted and so distraught. We wonder why we're not well, and yet the writing is on the wall.
Another great example of what you're describing and what we're talking about arose in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. And in a particular chapter, there's a community in Pennsylvania of Italian immigrants. It's a small town they live in, about 10,000 people. A medical researcher is drawn to go study them because there's an odd phenomenon occurring in the town. There's no heart disease there. And they don't know why. So this researcher comes in and studying their diet. Maybe they've, for instance, brought olive oil with them instead of the more common practice of that era when they emigrated, which was the usage of lard. But no, they had adapted the local custom and were using lard in their diets. There was nothing dietary to attribute to why there was no heart disease in this community. And so the researcher had to step out of purely biologic or physical cause and step into social cause. And what they discovered was that in this small town, there were over 100 social and civic organizations. Everyone knew everyone else. They were interconnected. Because of the very nature of so many organizations connecting the entire town, what are we describing? We're describing fractal connection. All these threads between all these odd shapes, all these different ways that all of the different organizations are connected, but more importantly, the people are connected to each other. In essence, everyone knows everyone else. And that interconnection made it so that on a certain very intrinsic level, that interconnection had healed the notion of heart disease. So what we're talking about here, coming full circle, is about the notion of how direct or conscious action that we brought up initially from David Graeber helps us get directly to the heart of how communities can re-engage with egalitarian practices on the local level, rather than perpetuating what is known as enclosure and what has now become, in this age, techno-feudalism.
In our next episode, we'll explore the history behind the practice of enclosure, as well as the history of common lands and common goods. Conversations on Healing and Growth is produced by Ben Umstead and Martin Perkins, with editing and music by Ben Umstead.